To order. Tonight, welcome everybody. Tonight's work session is to review the second phase of the superintendent's proposed budget for 2023-24 school year. Tonight, we are going to focus on the integrated grants planned and ESSER funding. We are also pleased to be joined by the Community Budget Review Committee this evening. For those of you who don't know, CBRC is composed of community volunteers who review, evaluate, and make recommendations to the board regarding the superintendent's proposed budget and any other budgetary issues the CBRC identifies. CBRC also monitors and advises the board on the allocation and expenditure of local option levy funds. So thank you everybody for giving your time to this. We do have a consent agenda item, which we were going to vote on now, but I think I'm going to hold on that until Director Brim Edwards gets here. So we may take a short pause in the meeting later. It should only take about 5 minutes tops. And we'll be able to go through that. So I think moving on to our CBRC and overall agenda tonight, I think it would be helpful to take a moment to introduce ourselves. So I'm going to start. We can go around the table. I'm Andrew Scott. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the chair of the school board this year. Why don't we go with you?
I'm Ailey Lowry, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am a member of the school board.
I'm Amy Constant, she, her pronouns, board member.
Michelle DePass, she, her pronouns, board member.
Gary Hollins, I am the vice chair of the board.
Herman Green, I'm just a board.
Olympia Calvert, CBRC.
Roger Kirshner, CBRC member.
Lisa Selman, CBRC member.
Karate Cruz, community member.
Jonathan Garcia, Chief of Staff.
Alberto Gradillo, Chief Financial Officer.
Leslie Odell, Senior Director of Funded Programs, she, her pronouns.
Liz Large, Contractor General Counsel.
Sorry, Cheryl Proctor, Deputy Superintendent of Instruction, High School Communities.
Good evening, Guadalupe Guerrero, superintendent.
Irene McMahon, student representative.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody else who's here. Anybody else?
We do have some CBRC members virtually.
Oh, perfect. Thank you for the reminder. Welcome. Go ahead and feel free to introduce.
Hi, I'm
Grace
Mariah Dula. I'm one of the CBRC members, and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Deshelle. I'm a CBRC member, and I use she, her pronouns as well.
Chair, if it's okay, we have some senior staff.
And I'm Grace, CBRC member, and I use she, her pronouns also.
Great. Thank you for joining us virtually. Appreciate it.
There's some senior staff, maybe community members may not know. So Jay, if you would like to also.
Jay Buno, Chief of Student Support Services.
Dr. Kimberly Armstrong, Chief Academic Officer.
John Franco, he, him, Chief of Schools.
Jordan Cooper, Confidential Executive Assistant. Pronouns are they, them.
Sharon Reese, Chief of HR, pronouns she, her.
Aurora Hummel, Director of College and Career Readiness.
James Crawford, he, him, and Senior Director of Corrections.
Joanna Tobin, Senior Director of Core Academics, Middle Grades and Middle Grades Redesign, she, her.
Dana Nirenberg, Senior Director of Academic Programs, K. Emily Glasgow, she, her, Senior Director of Pre-K through 5th grade for academic and teaching and learning.
Christina Howard, she, her, Senior Director, Teaching Professional Learning.
Ian Young, he, him, Chief Operating Officer. Don Wolf, he, him, Chief Technology Officer.
Since we've done most of the room, I would love to do the rest.
Kara Bradshaw, Executive Assistant, she, her pronouns.
Roseanne Paul, Board Manager, she, her pronouns.
David Skolton, 4th grade teacher at Crescent Elementary School.
I'm Hollis Blanchard. I'm the parent of an online learning academy student.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. And Terry, who's always making sure we are streaming online. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Terry.
Superintendent.
Yes, so thank you, and good evening again, directors, our CBRC members, staff, and those that are tuned in. Tonight sort of represents the next phase of our continued budget development work. In a typical year, you might hear about the different revenue streams we get through some of these larger state grants that come our way as a K-12 system here in Oregon. Which has chosen to do something different based on a lot of feedback. What if we actually integrated all of these and you rolled them into one more coherent proposal. So that's exactly the exercise that team has gone through, and which is why you see a whole cast of supporting characters tonight, because I predict you might have a question or two. So they're here to entertain those. But starting off this evening is our Chief of Staff, Jonathan Garcia, and then we'll go from there.
Awesome. So joining me to do this presentation is our CFO and our Deputy Superintendent. So let's get started here. So what we'll do is let us, if it's okay, we'd like to go through the integrated grants application presentation and then have a pause for conversation, and then we transition to Esther. So it's a two-part conversation today. Again, talking about the integrated grant plan and Esther. So this year, just to kind of set the context, we're presenting the superintendent's proposed budget in three phases. So in January, you heard from us around school staffing and central office actions. Today, again, you're going to hear about our special revenue, specifically our integrated grants plan, which we'll speak to in a little bit, and Esther. Next month, you will see on April 25th what we would consider phase 3, which is the superintendent's full budget proposal. So as the superintendent alluded to, a year ago, the Oregon Department of Education released a new tool, if you will, called Aligning for Student Success, Integrated Guidance for 6 ODE Initiatives. And the purpose of that was to integrate 6 programs that PPS is responsible for administrating. And so this is this is the first year of this integrated plan. It's not the first year that we've received many of these funds, but they were trying to make it easier for school districts to think about how they align their strategy, their work to these dollars. So that's what we'll be talking about today. Next slide. So again, you're all familiar with this. I won't spend too much time here, but you all know that we are guided by our vision, PPS Reimagined, which serves as our destination. Where is it that we want to be as a school system? Where does our community want to be as a school system? And many of you participated in that development. We also developed a roadmap, right? What is the...
I'm sorry to interrupt. I did see there was a hand up, I think from Alana, and I just wanted to make sure before we go any further, if that was an intentional hand.
Yeah, we were interrupted and weren't able to fully introduce ourselves as CBRC, so I wanted to make sure that for the record, my name is Ilana J. Wilson, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a part of the CBRC. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry we missed you first time around. Appreciate that.
So thank you. So our strategic plan really provides us a roadmap that represents the changes and the shifts that we want to make over the next few years to get us to that destination. And obviously we have a compass, which is what our board goals, right? You've set really targeted goals around student achievement, particularly for students of color, particularly for Black and Native students. And so I think that serves as our compass, right? It gives us an understanding of how and where we're going. And so if we go to the next slide, so understanding that these are 3 driving documents that guide PPS, what we're trying to do and what ODE has asked us to do is to begin to align all of these investments towards our strategic plan. And that's what we're trying to do and what we're attempting to do with all of these. And so what you'll hear from the superintendent in his proposed budget is a further alignment. Again, to the vision strategic plan, and as you know, if you've seen our strategic plan, it's broken down to 4 themes: racial equity and social justice, inclusive and differentiated learning for every child, professional excellence and support, and this broader context around embracing change. So again, we're trying to align dollars, time, and efforts to improve efficacy and culture that better serve our schools, students, families, and educators so that they can thrive and achieve excellence. So next slide, and then one more after that. So again, we're talking about integrated grants plan. So here are the 6 programs that this is related to: high school student success, student investment account, SIA, continuous improvement plan, CT, career technical education, everyday matters, and early indicator and intervention systems. Some of these are likely more familiar to you, such as SIA or high school success, or what we typically refer to as Measure 98 and CTE. These grants have common elements and goals and total approximately $52 million. So again, what we're talking about for integrated grants is $52 million each year for the next 2 years at the current funding rate. The common elements of these grant plans have strong alignment with our strategic plan, Forward Together, and the investments were informed by the strategic planning process. This process involved a comprehensive needs assessment with community engagement, data analysis, and a district-wide budget engagement process. Much of the information which you can find in the narrative that we submitted to you and that is in your materials. So we also hosted student families and community members, focal student groups were intentionally engaged through the process. And again, we can speak to that if time allows. I will say on behalf of the district, and if anybody from OD is listening, that we appreciate the state moving in this direction because again, as we think about the work of the system, right, we're trying to align and create a cohesive approach versus these, buckets of dollars. So again, when people usually think about, oh, what's Measure 98? No, we need to think about what's high school student success in its entirety, collected to strategic plan. The dollars are just what pays for the activity, right? So the strategy is really important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Norberto to take us through the next few slides.
Yeah, next slide, please. And so as before I get into that slide, I think it's important to just kind of share the context as we're working towards the superintendent's proposed budget on April 25th, that we want to continue to leverage these conversations so that we get your feedback and questions. And although our integrated grant funds are restricted to specific activities, and I'll share a little bit more of what that means, but it's similar to our last board work session. We're thinking about what are some of those areas of investments that we want to continue to focus in. And, I think when we think about one of the largest investments that we do to support our day-to-day operations it comes from the general fund, and it's our teaching allocations. And I want to share that we'll have an update on projected class sizes before the end of the week. So kind of putting that out there because I know that is a question and a lot of interest. So it's kind of like addressing the elephant in the room and noting that we will be sharing that information. So with this slide, it may look familiar. We've talked about our 5 major funds, and it's important to note about half of our budget is restricted. It's restricted due to bonds. So really specific activities that relate to that and cannot support day-to-day activities. And knowing that our general funds are our day-to-day funding source, to continue to orient us tonight, we're going to be focusing on the special revenue fund. So that's that slice of the pie, which it's Pi Day. It is important to think about the special revenue funds as a category of funding sources that contain largely restricted funding sources. And so for today, we'll talk about integrated grants and ESSER. Next slide, please. And so I'd like to provide you with an overview of the different funding sources. I will point out that this slide has been updated to include this year's column. So I'm not sure if we got a chance to provide the latest version, but from the version that was posted, I wanted to provide the funding for this current year for comparative purposes. And with High School Success Act, that's ballot measure 98, its primary purpose is to increase graduation rates and ensure high school students are ready for college and career. So now we move on to Student Investment Act, which is funded to support meeting students' mental health or behavioral needs and reduce academic disparities and increase academic achievement for focal student groups. Continuous improvement planning. So again, another funding source that are requirements under the Every Student Succeeds Act, funding our CSI and TSI schools, and focuses on key areas to improve student outcomes. We then have our Career Techno-Education Funds, also known as Perkins. And the State Board of Education adopted the CTE state plan to develop the CTE programs of study. And through this plan, the state invests federal funds to improve access and participation in education and training programs to prepare learners for high-wage, high-skill, and demand careers. We have Everyday Matters. This is actually $0, and it's embedded in the other 5 programs. It outlines requirements to address chronic absenteeism through attention to student engagement, school culture, climate and safety, culturally sustaining pedagogy, family and community involvement. And the expectation is that's just embedded in all the other funding sources. Finally, we have the early indicators and intervention systems, which provides a small allocation to assist us to collect and analyze predictive student data to support students and engage students and their families to coordinate systems of care and learning supports. So as you can see by these descriptions, each has its own discrete purpose and is intended to augment our general fund. So kind of getting back to restricted for specific purposes. On the next slide, while the integrated funds make up about 1/6 of our special revenue bucket, these grant investments deepen and expand our strategic plan work to disrupt the inequities and foster some of the inclusive partnerships and collaboration to provide some of those differentiated learning opportunities. So we have our general fund, and then we rely on our special revenue funding sources, particularly these integrated grants, to further enhance and align our investments, activities, and specific strategies from our strategic plan. And these investments are highly integrated, and together they help advance our commitment to high quality, inclusive academic learning environments, and really to address some of the racial inequities. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Proctor to go a little deeper and share some of the key investments.
So if you go to the next slide, please.
I have a question. Quick question. So when I look at like CTE, last year getting 511,000. Now this year is getting 435. Is that because the grant we received is less, or is that because of the allocations that I'm assuming the super or someone put together as a Dutch?
It's the grant.
The grant.
So the grant was
These are formula grants, yes.
Yeah.
Are we taking questions?
We're actually mostly holding questions, I think.
Okay.
Get rid of
Yeah, I'm just gonna go over, well, we're almost at the end of this first half. I just have one slide that I'm gonna go over, and I think it will take us.
Kara, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you.
Okay, so in an effort to go a little deeper, just to orient us, the previous slide gave the big buckets, and I'm gonna go a little bit deeper to share that this integrated plan invests in focal student groups and school-based on need, with the emphasis on improving culturally responsive, site-based learning experiences. Our investments align with key priorities identified in our needs assessment, priorities that are also expressed in our community. It's important that we focus on an improved classroom experience, so we maintain classroom size beyond what we would have been able to do with general funds, and having our youngest learners, our kindergarten students in our Title I schools continue to benefit from educational assistance, for example. Prioritize learning with differentiated and flexible experiences that increase access to the arts, interest-based activities, self-directed learning, and engagements is what our students deserve. And in this proposal, we maintain our educational arts pathways and other access to rich interest-based electives and learning opportunities. This includes career-related programs that emphasize real-world hands-on learning, and also continued investments in advanced coursework, especially for our students of color. Strong multi-tiered systems of supports include wraparound social, emotional, mental, and behavioral health services that, combined with academic supports, provide a comprehensive, responsive, and critical supports for our students. Our investments in this area includes our restorative justice advocates who build and strengthen community and to repair harm as part of our work to reorient this, students who have experienced some level of culture infraction. Schools have dedicated social workers, college coordinators, and attendance coaches, along with tiered academic and social emotional supports. The racial equity and social justice resonating partnerships continue, again, to support our students of color particularly. So all of these proposed investments are coupled with equity-centered, research-based, and data-informed continuous improvement processes across schools to address our core need, to eliminate the educational opportunity and outcomes gaps for our students, especially our students of color. And then it's important to also note a couple of things, that 68% of PPS high school students are currently enrolled in CTE courses. In the class of 2022, 93.8% of CTE completers graduated with a 4-year cohort degree, and professional learning to complement and deepen our bond, and general fund investments in new core curricular and instructional framework work is a body of work that's most important, that's very important, and we continue to do that as well. So these are all some examples of how these investments have been utilized. Next slide. And I will turn it back over to Jonathan.
Awesome. So at this point, we're going to turn it over to you for questions, comments, and I want to kind of emphasize a few points here. The integrated grants plan is due to the state of Oregon on March 31st. So as a reminder, you have all the materials in your board packet, which includes a resolution, which you'll be voting on next Tuesday to approve this integrated grants plan. Again, with the deadline of March 31st. What we have here is a picture of the documents that you have in front of you. And so I want to pause here because I'm sure you're going to want to go into the details here. So that's why we have our incredible staff here. If you look at this big document or packet that you received, page 1 through 5 gives you a sense of how these dollars are connected directly to the goals and strategic outcomes outlined in our strategic plan. So that's one reference point for you to, if you have questions or want to ask or want to comment on that, that'd be great. Then page 6 through 27 is the budget. And Roseanne should be here any minute now, because I do understand that table, but the way that it printed out, it doesn't have it all in one page. So she's bringing kind of a 3-pager so that you can kind of look through it a little easier. But essentially, you have here how PPS plans to use these $52 million by staff and by resource. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you all. We will facilitate questions and comments, and I'll defer to you when you want to transition over to Esther.
I have a quick sort of technical process question. The board's required, I'm thinking from ODE's perspective, the board's required to approve the integrated grant plan by the end of March, but we don't approve the budget. We approve the budget in May and adopt the budget in June. How does ODE see those things meshing?
Leslie, do you want to talk? So Leslie's been our liaison and our lead on all of this. So she can speak.
Yeah, she's our senior director over grants and federal grants programs. So she's got all of the knowledge.
As much as I have been given, yes. And so I would agree, and as districts, we actually voiced some concern over the deadlines. I think from their perspective, from ODE's perspective, you're approving the overall plan in terms of, yes, the investment areas that we have earmarked, as it were, we have decided upon with community engagement in all our process are the areas in which we would like to invest, and we're proposing. Once the all the districts apply, and they do they're still in the middle of their process of what hasn't been spent, what's been spent, and then they're going to reallocate out. So our final budget that they're going to give us is going to come in the form of a grant agreement sometime, we are told, in June, which will coincide with the end of the budget process for us, which at that point we would readjust and fine tune to the penny what we really are allocated. This is the preliminary. And then we would go through there, and it becomes in the form of a grant agreement, which comes in front of you, again, to approve. Hope that wasn't too long of an answer. That was
So we
nice.
will receive it before we before we approve our budget.
I wish I could say that, Director Constant.
We might.
We might. Last year, we got it in late September.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go ahead and open up the questions from the board or CBRC members. I'm comfortable sort of letting people kind of popcorn in around the questions. So
Great. And just what is being passed around, I know, I'm sorry, it's smaller than, you better have your glasses with you.
old people. Huh?
Where's the magnifier?
I know. So we can try and get a different printout, maybe, but
You're trying.
I have a couple questions. On the slide 9, I think it must be slide 9. The units of measure are like FTE versus in some categories there's a dollar figure. And so I'm having a hard time like understanding. I guess if all the units were measured in FTE or dollars, it would be easier to sort of get a fuller picture. That's one question.
so can I?
Yeah.
So I think
Please.
that's a fair question. I mean, so the slide deck was meant to be a kind of a holistic summary.
Mhm.
Again, the details are in here, or in this big one,
Okay.
in here. So starting on page.
So are they all in dollars on the?
It's on dollars and FTE, so
Okay.
you'll see.
But each category has both, or?
Correct.
And to clarify, some of the investments do not have FTEs associated with them.
Okay.
So for example, like the CBO and charter pass-through, like those investments, that is dollars versus
That's dollars,
FTEs.
okay.
And on the budget, when it is large enough for
Just
many
see
people
this
to read it,
FTE,
it
yes.
actually will, it says what line item has FTE and what isn't associated.
Okay. Are we, by taking an integrated approach, realize any savings in overhead or admin fees or anything like that?
No. I mean, each grant still maintains its individual personality.
Okay.
What they've done is consolidated the application and reporting process. So we don't have 6 different applications. It's consolidated in
Okay.
those elements, but not necessarily.
And then just a comment about printing on both sides of the paper. So the climate justice people would like to see us use 50% as much paper as possible. So that's it. Thank you.
I have a question. I want to make it known to the public, Karanja Cruz, for the record, that our Oregon Secretary of Oregon did an audit for PPS and for ODE. The final audit came out, I believe, last year, May 6th of 2022. And one of the recommendations, it stated that the PPS board should ensure that the district administrators prioritize key steps to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of district operations and programs. Developing a strategic plan, which you guys all presented, but also to develop and to improve the district's feedback loops and to trust between the central administrative staff, principals, and teachers. So I wanted to know, what is the update in terms of the measurable goals that you guys are looking to receive from the student outcome? So if I look at the student investment, that's a huge amount. That's like $54 million. What is the return on investment? So that's a huge investment. So what is the measurable goals that you guys have created based off of this audit? Excuse me. So what has been the current data that you guys can share? And then so that's one question. And then what's been the return on the investment so far of the $54 million that's been spent?
Well,
Because
let's be
if I
clear,
look at
the money hasn't been spent. This is for next year.
Well, I'm talking about, you alluded to many of the, first of all, I appreciate the programs being integrated, and you alluded that we already have spent money based around these different programs. So I'm wondering, do you have any outcomes based on those, of that money spent? And then what is the future outcomes that you guys are looking for based around this audit as well that you guys are going to report out?
Yeah, so I think, great question. So I think one, I don't think the audit governs how we operate as a school district. So it was an independent audit done by the state. We have followed to the extent that we saw, that we needed to make changes. So very much agree with that, but it doesn't govern our day-to-day. Our day-to-day is student achievement and student outcomes, which none of the folks at the Secretary of State have expertise to start with. So that's one. Two, I think, to your point, the student outcomes that we're looking at are attached to the board goals, right? So the board, as our 7 board members, have come up with, board goals for student achievement, whether it's around high school graduation, literacy, math, sense of belonging. All of those things are part of that, which, in fact, are how we're using all of our dollars, whether it's the $52 million here or the $1.88 billion that we run as an organization, right? So again, this is less than 3% of the budget, and we recognize that we have to report on outcomes, right? And so when you think about whether it's, and I'll defer to my colleagues, but when you look at, for example, the investments in social workers, right? The 34 social workers, there are outcomes both that are soft and hard. The hard ones we're looking at through the board goals that the board has established, and Dr. Adams reports on that on a quarterly basis. There are the soft ones, right? The ways in which our social workers are making a dramatic impact. When it was 40% of our SIA dollars going to social workers, right? That you can see the soft impact that it's having on students. Anything else that you would add?
Yeah, I would just offer that that we have a cycle of reviewing our data and reviewing our outcomes as aligned to the board goals. As the chief of staff noted, that for all of these investments that we make, there are identified goals, but the outcomes may look different. So it may not translate immediately into what we want to look at, for example, in terms of student achievement. But sometimes in order to get to student achievement, as we know, we may need to improve our curricular offerings. We may need to improve our classroom experiences for students that are both instructional improvements and also addressing the social emotional needs of students. But we also, again, have this cycle where, according to the board goals, we make regular reports to the board regarding some of our outcomes, and some of these outcomes include when we are looking at MAP data initially, when we're looking at MAP growth data with the board, when we are sharing information about our graduation rates. So each would point uniquely to a variety of investments made, but the outcomes will not all look the same because they're not all measured the same.
I want to say something really quick.
Have we been meeting the board goals?
I want to thank you for your question, because I think it's an excellent question. And it was a really simple question. It was, for the dollars that we spend, what is the outcome? What are the outcomes? Is that correct? So I just think it's a great question. I'm listening really hard for an answer.
Yeah, and then
and also I want to also say that if we could introduce ourselves each time we speak, so the people that are hybrid, virtual, can understand which perspective is coming. So just, if you could just say, my name is, and this is who I am.
Sure, Shita.
Yeah.
So if you could look at slide 26, which is in your appendix, it's the last slide, Roseanne. There is a piece here that we talk about PPS. So ODE is requiring us to develop a longitudinal performance growth targets. As shown in the slide here. So we have to, so these are referred to as the 5 common metrics. third grade reading proficiency rates measured by ELA, ninth grade on-track rates, regular attendance rates, 4-year on-time graduation rates, 5-year completion rates, and other local metrics may be used to develop applicable performance growth targets. Again, these are all aligned to the board goals.
Can I jump in? Because I want to sort of second, I think it's a really good question, and I want to sort of repeat back what I think I heard to make sure that I understand it, because it's the kind of question we're hearing a lot, and we're hearing a lot not just from the public, but we're even hearing it from the state, right? The sense of like, you know, how do we know that what you're doing with the dollars is working? What I think I heard is that, again, we've got a $1.8 billion budget. Of this $50 million, very hard to say this $50 million resulted in this student achievement for these students. What it is possible to say is this $50 million resulted in the following inputs and outputs. Right? We know how many people we hired, we know the curriculum we installed, we know what we did. And then we need to look at those overall outcomes, right, for students to determine whether the entire system is moving in that direction. And to get back to your question, because I don't want it to go unanswered, in terms of the overall board goals, you know, we're going to know more this fall. What we saw during the pandemic was a decrease, right, in the student achievement that we had set as a board goal. We also saw less of a decrease in Portland Public Schools than we did statewide, which is one of those really tricky things, because I don't ever want to talk about a decrease as a good thing. I think we lost 3% of our you know, student sort of achievement metrics. Statewide, they lost 10. I guess I'd prefer to be in a district that lost 3 versus 10. I'd prefer to be in a district that's gaining 3 to 5% every year. And I think that's when we get new data this fall, is that question we're going to come back to. But did I summarize right in terms of we're focused on a slice here? There's a larger picture.
Yeah, there's the larger picture, and then for each slice there's a different measure. So it's gonna look different when we talk about what's the return on investment for social workers, what's the return on investment for the curriculum, what's the return on the investment for teacher professional learning. Like the measure is going to be different for each of those. It's not going to look the same. They all will bubble up ultimately over time into increased student achievement. But we know with each of these things that we do, we have a plan, we have resources aligned to a plan, but we also have to implement. And then implementation over time is when we will see the end result. It doesn't happen all in the same year, say, based on continuous improvement practices and models and what we see when we are doing what we call change management.
I just want to make sure I'm clear on this too, because I'm like Director Scott, I'm searching for the answer. So am I correct in hearing that the outcomes that we're looking for from the investments that are going in is to align to what our board goals is?
Yes.
I just want to make sure I'm clear. So all the investments that we're doing, all the $1.8 billion that we're doing, end result is to match or beat our board goals.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And part of how we know we're doing that as a system is that we examine very closely each of the school improvement planning process, and we guide and advise our schools to align some of their school level plans to the board goals as appropriate to their levels, so that we are driving in the same direction for improved student experiences in the classroom, for improved instructional practices, for improvement around curricular use, et cetera. And then we will all level up together and ultimately meet those board goals.
And then another question too. So I'm assuming this investment, this integrated grant plan stuff, and all the different investments that's happened in the previous years as well, right? Or is this that we've gotten all these funds, or we've gotten them before, right? So how?
At least within the past couple of years, we could say since COVID that there are buckets of funds that we have received. It's not long. Like a long term in the past. There are only certain buckets that would fall under that. Could you clarify?
Yeah, the different grants have been in existence for several years. Notably, the SIA was 2019. Now, we did have the longitudinal growth performance targets with SIA, but those were due to COVID. That was suspended and they're reinstated this year. There are CTE particular programmatic goals, Measure 98, et cetera. And I can have the content-specific people speak exactly to those metrics.
And these are goals established with ODE.
Correct.
Right? Like, so like as we refine the process.
Yes, the longitudinal performance growth targets will come to in front of the board to be approved with the grant agreements when they're final, but it is expected that ODE and PPS work together to identify those goals and refine those goals with the data ODE provides. And so Dr. Adams will be working closely to make sure those not only meet ODE's expectations, but also are in alignment with our board goals.
So just want to emphasize, I think, that the longitudinal performance growth targets will be coming back to the board as
Correct.
part of the agreement
Correct.
in June or June, July.
Let's go to Roger and then Amy and then.
Roger Kirschner, CBRC. An observation. I think evaluation is very, very critical. As a longtime observer of this district, for over 50 years, additional resources have been funneled toward Title I, TSI schools. There has been a lack of measurement as to what's success. When you hear reports from Dr. Adams about the various gaps that exist among various groups, it's very disappointing to see that there is effective results of the investments that are being made. I wanted to ask the question, what is ODE's latitude in reviewing our grant application? Do they have the authority to say, nix, we don't like this, and send it back? Or are we to just assume that anything we send to Salem is automatically blessed and we'll get our allocation? Or how's that work?
I am led to believe that if there are clarifying questions and they need more information, that they will be reaching out and seeking that information before any approvals are moved forward.
And the legislature has the nasty habit of waiting until the revenue projections, they come out in May and before they finally act. And do we have any assurance that the legislature is going to pass an education allocation before the end of the session, or are we going to go into extra days?
I don't have any information nor assurances.
So we know on the calendar, the legislature's going to be taking up the state school fund in the coming week, but when districts get their final allocation is the right question, Roger.
I just got a clarity. Did you guys already ask your question?
Oh, no, go ahead.
So a board goal, can you give me like this one board goal? What is one board goal that you guys have?
Third grade reading, fifth grade math.
Fifth grade math.
I'm gonna be specific, so.
All right,
hold on. We get specific, I think it should be out here. So when we talk about fifth grade math, for instance, African American, and this is the growth percentage that's supposed to go up per year. African Americans is 4.4%. Pacific Islanders is 4.1%. Native Americans is 3.5%. Latinos, students 3.2%. Asian students like 1.2% per year for fifth grade math. And then it's the same thing for third grade reading, African Americans by 5.5%.
That's the growth.
As measured by the Oregon State Assessment System. African Americans 5.5% for third grade reading per year. Pacific Islanders 5%. Native Americans by 6.1%. Latinos by 3.9%, and Asian students by 2.6%. So, and then we got into, you can go into high school graduation rates, post-secondary readiness. So all those are specific goals that we have charged the superintendent to, hey, these are our goals that we would like to accomplish by the end of every year.
All right, so my question is, that goal aligned with all of the FTE that is in the student investment that you guys are wanting to invest in? So if you go back to the slide where it has the 54 million breakdown, and it has all of the different FTE. So is that FTE going to be focused on that particular goal that the board has? And how,
Sure.
what would that look like in terms of?
Is all of the staff that's listed there solely working on reading and math achievement? I think if we're gonna see those kinds of accelerated outcomes, part of what you see there is capacity needed to support conditions in schools, whether that's coaching, professional development, whether it's wraparound supports for students so they're ready to learn. I mean, theory is that the combination of these things is gonna help support improved outcomes for our students. This is what I'm a superintendent.
So I'll give an example. So I think that's a great question. So let's look at high school success measure 98. So outcome goals for the 2022 graduates. Mostly gained African-American students, 79.4. We exceeded that by 3.9. Pacific Islanders, 83.3. We exceeded that by 10 points. Native American students, 61.5. We exceeded that by 11.5. 71% of all graduates met one of our board-defined post-secondary readiness indicators. So 21% AP. Again, I think you've heard most of this in different iterations. 20.4% of IB, 13.6 took a dual credit course, 25.4 took a CTE, 20.8 received a seal by literacy, 44.4% were part of a college readiness as measured by the PSA, or had college readiness as measured by the PSAT, SAT, and ACT. And then 93.4% of CT completers graduated in 4 years. So those are the outcomes that are coming from a direct investment in 10 high school college coordinators, the student attending coaches. So those are just examples of how we are thinking about the input. I love how you put it, Chair Scott, the inputs that are helping develop the outcomes.
But that's exactly the question that this group is to weigh in on. When we look at that list, and we think about those board goals and what the district needs, the superintendent's put together a plan that he thinks, yeah, I think this is the way to achieve the strategic plan and vision and goals we've laid out. I think it's for this group to ask the questions, right? And I'm gonna pick on something just for the sake of argument. 21 FTE for improving arts education pathways. A question that would be a legitimate question is, should that be 21 or should that be 15? And we should put 6 more of those FTE in terms of instructional coaches for K through 12. And I think that's, the sort of thing that again, there's some flexibility there in terms of where we focus.
Right, so on that one, just as an example, because SIA asked districts to work on providing an enriching whole education, this provided an opportunity for us as PPS to close opportunity gaps that didn't exist for identified schools with incomplete arts pathways. So this level of teaching positions in particular ensures that we do have a continuum so that students do have a fuller student experience in schools that historically have not. And that's why 4 years ago, you saw this as part of, and continues to be part of our ongoing proposed investments.
Okay, let me
This is school focused then. It's gonna be school focused.
All of these dollars are going to schools.
No, I get that, right? Like, I'm talking about like, is it gonna be focused on particular schools that
Yes,
have
they
a
are.
population that's gonna help?
Yes,
meet
these
them?
are. These are
But
specifically.
which mirrors the general fund as well. Like if you look at our funding per student, which is included in the back of the second volume of the budget for last year, you'll see, you've probably looked at that before, that how differentiated it is. And I think it's fair to say that the grants mirror those same criteria that are used really for the general fund.
Amy, did you have? Okay.
Andrew, the board and as well as CBRC has received numerous communications from the CBOs about the allocation that there is on this chart that's on the screen. 1.6 million is woefully wanting for what they're advocating. And just today, I received 3 more pages of their advocacy. So, and it largely revolves around, my understanding at least, the allocation that is provided for special ed type of students and that are served in these schools and how the the district allocates resources for that.
Thank you. I do see, and I hadn't seen it before, both Grace and Alana have their hands up. I apologize if they've been up for a while. I'll try and keep looking up there.
And if I just want to make sure, because I made sure to put "and" with an underscore in capital. So if you look at your document here, I just want to make sure for full transparency here. You're looking at CBO allocations at 649 and charter school allocations at a little bit over $1 million. Do you want to talk about how the decision was made around CBO allocations?
Yep. So this is Norberto speaking. So similar to what we've done in previous years, we use a formula that takes into account the total SIA pot and then looks at the average daily membership. And so it's like, okay, based on the average daily membership, we come up with a value, and then the number of CBO, like projected CBO students, is what's used to calculate the funding. And so using that same formula, for example, this current year, it was about $850,000. And that gets distributed amongst the different CBOs. And so now, if y'all recall in one or two slides prior, our SIA allocations going down. So the pie is shrinking. And what also shrunk is the number of students when we look at our estimates. So that calculation taken together generates the revised number of, in this case, $650,000. So it's about $200,000 less for CBOs. Forget the exact number for charters as well, but overall, the portion of the SIA allocation is smaller. So by default, sticking with the same formulas we've used, those pass-through amounts are also smaller or less.
And so I just want to underscore, I understand that there's been a lot of advocacy, there's opinions on the board. And so, oh, thank you. Oh, here's the much easier one to read. Thank you. So I just, and as this one is going out, I just want to note that that's on the second page, almost at the top. So,
Can I ask about that proportional?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So the pie is shrinking. Is it shrinking proportionate to the shrinking of enrollment?
Yeah, so yes, to ADM or average daily
ADM.
membership weighted.
Okay.
So as we look at our ADMW, there's less. It doesn't help that our funding amount is also less, and so then that then translates to less numbers, and that's or less funding, and that's keeping with the same formula. So like thinking of how we've just allocated that funding, the inputs are smaller, so therefore you end up with a smaller output.
And that's felt immediately as where our numbers are suppressed by a year or so because we're on a rolling clock.
So what we,
right?
What we've done because of that feedback since last year, we actually for our CBOs, we use a 2-year prior rolling average.
So we're using a rolling average now versus the instantaneous.
Versus the current moment for CBO calculations. So we're using their ADMW from 2022.
Okay.
And like this current year, we were using 2021. And as we get into next year, like the enrollment decline is catching up with them. And so as we use those numbers, that calculates that amount of funding for them.
So how much did they go down this year as opposed to?
From this year to next year?
No, from last year.
From last year to this year, it was fairly consistent. The formula calculated about $850,000. But last year, we made a one-time funding increase of about $1 million through ESSER. Or no, excuse me, I think it was SIA.
SIA.
Yes. Yeah. So that was a one-time increase. And now we've recalibrated back to
So
the
now
methodology.
the issue, because we always say that one-time increase without mentioning that there were people in the bucket that weren't supposed to be there. They got moved out when the allocation was originally made.
So, well, no, I mean, to clarify, like the bucket was rolled up and included like all the
So
different.
we put more people in the bucket, or no?
No. So
Help me understand the bucket they're coming out of.
So the bucket that this SIA's CBO amount is coming out of is the 36 million, or 36.7 million.
Right.
And so that funding, we then take into account what the ADMW is going to be. We apply that number against the number of students or students that we expect or project from FY20, well, not project, but use from FY22. We then calculate against the ADMW. So for example, in our school system, if we have $36 million and our ADMW is 55,000, we take our current 55,000 divided by 36 million, which then generates a per unit ADMW, so $600 something. We look at what CBO enrollment was in 2022, and we calculate the ADMW. We apply a poverty weight because we know these students need additional resources.
Got it.
And then we calculate it against that unit. And then that's what generates the number, the allocation. So from a methodology in calculating the SIA allocation, that's stayed consistent. The what we were referencing, Director Green, was in our budget book, we rolled everything up and just didn't do a good job of explaining of how those different funding sources were being distinguished.
We left the
Mechanics.
impression that we honored it
So
with a supplement.
And that was that one-time $1 million.
And it was very clear
sorry,
that it was one time when it happened.
Yes.
I want to get to the folks who are virtual,
Oh, yeah.
but we can come back to this. We'll have some time if we want to come back to that in the parking lot. So,
And then can I remind everybody to say their name again before they speak? So sorry, it's hard to remember.
thanks. I'm not sure Alana or Grace who was first, but either one of you, welcome to go. Alana
Grace.
or
I
Grace.
think she's finally Grace is first.
Oh, there she is.
Hi, so I'm Grace Groom. I'm a CBRC member. I'm also a PAT member, and I'm currently serving at Markham Elementary School teaching second grade. I think my question is in line with Karanja Cruz's questions about the FTE and how it is allotted. We started the meeting hearing about the compass being eliminating opportunity gaps and increasing student achievement in targeted efforts. And I'd like to hear more about how the 324.33 FTE in this grant is specifically targeting supports for our students of color and our Native American students. The instructional coaches that are being distributed. I think that's regardless of demographics and size. And so I don't know how that is exact targeting the greatest needs. I understand the philosophy of, if we raise all the, give everybody more, then all the boats will rise. But I don't think that's the goal of this IGG. The goal of the IGG is to really be targeted. So I want to hear more about how things are targeted specifically with the FTE.
Grace, we got almost all of your question, but there was a key moment when you started talking about instructional coaches that cut out. Could you repeat that?
Yeah. My understanding is that the instructional coaches, there will be one, that this is a new thing for next year, from the general fund, cuts were made to, I think, 50 TOSA positions. And now we're seeing in this grant application, 31.5 instructional coaches, and that there will be one per school, regardless of demographics of the school, size of school, or need of the school in terms of the outcomes for students that we're seeing in our data. So I'm just really curious how all of the FTE, and in specific, the instructional coaches meets the requirements of the IGG to be targeted.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I can answer that. Kimberly Armstrong, Chief Academic Officer. So we will have instructional coaches in all of our buildings. All of our buildings are home to Black and Native students. And while our focus is on the instructional priorities, we will have some goals around specific growth for our subgroups. Our work is aligned with the board goals that are established in other strategic areas of the plan. And so we believe in being aligned with that, and more importantly, making sure that we're monitoring success. It's not, the instructional coach position is also about supporting teachers in their practice, being alongside principals as we continue to uplift our instructional priorities, which is our roadmap to educational equity. And so that's the way that we see that tie-in happening and that alignment of resources.
So Dr. Armstrong, I'm going to maybe ask you to maybe share kind of a day example. So an instructional coach is at Markham.
Sure.
How is that instructional coach going to make a difference in the lives of the Black children that are in some of those classrooms?
Yeah, absolutely. So imagining an instructional coach at Markham going through, let's say they're involved in visiting some classrooms and looking at data to have a conversation about the instruction that's happening, the curriculum that's being used, and then the effectiveness of how teachers are implementing said curriculum or the support that they may need. And so that instructional coach may be involved in conversations with teachers on their growth from a coaching perspective. That instructional coach could be involved with being in on a conversation with principals about intentional professional development to examine some opportunities for teachers, or that instructional coach could be involved in digging deep into the data, not just the data that's collected, of course, quarterly, but that data, whether it's map data, whether it's data from some of the curricular resources, and then being able to be a thought partner with the instructional leadership team on making some shifts to make sure that growth is happening. So those are all the different ways. And then also, we're staying in community with not just our principals, our teachers, and other district leaders from different offices to see how we can continue to fine tune the model and then collect data to make sure that a resource that is new at school buildings is not only being used in the way that it's supposed to be used, but we're hearing from the field how things are going so that we're making adjustments in real time.
What type of data are we collecting? Is it report card data? Is it achievement? Is it MAPS data? Is it report card data? Is it classroom assessment data? Curriculum adoption?
Yeah.
What type of data are you guys focusing on?
So we believe in leading indicators. We have the leading and lagging, and the lagging is that data that we collect that's those students are already probably matriculated onto another grade, or they've already probably graduated or some other thing. So of course that's important because that lets us know history, but the leading indicators, those data points that we collect with, maybe it's from unpacking a unit and teachers having conversations about grading and being aligned and collaborating on that. So that's data. We also, of course, map. iReady, depending on grade levels, right? It's specific to that. But any data that gives us the opportunity to tell us how students are doing in that moment or within a window of time where we can still deploy interventions, put resources in place, and be able to see that growth, right?
So which one? Sorry.
Well, it depends on the grade. Yeah, it depends on the grade level. So, okay. I mean, there's iReady data.
Let's say middle school.
Oh, so middle school is map data. And then there are assessments that are tied to our curricular resources. So those are, I would say, some of those leading indicators that we look at. But then again, I also want to make sure that that I emphasize the data that teachers collect when they're in community with one another, sort of in that like professional learning community, sort of that teaming or collaboration group together as well. And so multiple data sources, and just not too long ago, the principals engaged in the data session through the Office of School Performance, just looking at all the different types. And so we're also calibrating on those conversations around data and making sure that as a system, when we talk about, what data are we looking at to inform our next steps or our practice, that conversation looks the same, and the data is the similar data being accessed.
Yes, and we have our senior director for middle grades, for K-5, and also for high school core academics that can speak to the specific data pieces that are aligned to the curriculum. But another great example of how we align our goals and ensure that they are targeted to our underserved population of students, and it is a part of some of these investments is through learning acceleration, for example. And Dana Nurnberg, who is our senior director over the Learning Acceleration Program, can really speak to how it is that we use learning acceleration and those FTE as well to target to specific students, our Black and Native students specifically.
Those aren't part of the IGG, right? Though those are part of the ESSER funds that after next year will go away.
Correct, but you were talking about just in general about how funds are targeted?
Right.
Okay.
My question is that, especially with the instructional coaches, my understanding is that there's a chunk of funds that was saved by cutting the TOSAs from the general fund, and yet as part of this IGG that is more ongoing. It's a repeated grant. We're asking for instructional coaches, one at each school, not in an equitable way, but in an equal way. And it seems like maybe we should put instead in the IGG grant those learning acceleration specialists, and maybe more of them than just 20, when we have such a big named goal of the board to close those opportunity gaps and accelerate student learning. I think 20 FTE for our whole district with the needs that we have is not sufficient. And maybe that would be a better use of funds for this specific grant.
Right. And what I want to offer as a reminder as well, that when we started the presentation, that what is represented in the IGG is really a small slither of the overall budget. So yes, you're right, that there are other investments that are made that can very well answer the same questions as far as how is it that we're looking at the totality of our investments, targeted towards our board goals, and how are we utilizing and tracking some of those outcomes as well. So if the IGG conversation is just one part of the totality of investments that are made towards.
So I want to move on to Alana and Dashel, but I want to make sure we did and I think we've captured Grace's
We did
question.
capture, yes, thank you,
And
Grace.
I think to your point, the bigger thing to get to the whole CBRC on board in terms of how the bigger picture and this smaller
Correct.
picture integrate. Okay.
Correct, Grace. So
Thank
thank
you.
you so much for that question and that observation.
Alana, thank you for waiting.
Oh, no, you're fine. Thank you so much for coming back to us. Ilana J. Wilson, she, her pronouns, CBRC. And also I'm a Portland Public School graduate and worked with high school students ever since I graduated. So something that I have really focused on in following Measure 98 and SIA is really that 9th grade support, right? And making sure that our young people are supported in an adequate manner. And I know that when we first implemented this, there were not enough people really supporting those 9th graders to not drop out, and those dropout rates are really high. And so I'm really curious, I'm just looking at all these different FTE numbers. I'm really curious if someone can just explain exactly how many full-time employees there are that are going to be supporting our many students, specifically with that transition. so that they don't drop out.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we can certainly, I have both my senior director of high school core academics, and also I'd like to introduce Aurora, who is over career and technical education. She's prepared to answer that question.
Hi, thank you. So just
We may need you to come up and make sure the mic. Thank you.
Hi, Aurora, the Director of College and Career Readiness. So to support our ninth grade students, so as you spoke to, one of the leading indicators for high school graduation rates is ninth grade on track rates. So since the inception of Measure 98, we've invested a lot of funds in focusing on our ninth grade on track rates. And so we've invested, so you can see here on slide 9, our student performance coaches, which is 12.5 FTE. They each have a group of students of up to 30 that they focus on. So many of those tend to be our ninth grade students who are chronically absent. The student success team leads and instructional coaches, which is 12.5 FTE, focus. So the student success team leads bring data. So that next line, the student success team release time, which is 16.5 FTE, give our ninth grade teacher teams a common prep period. And so they come together every other day and they look at student data, their ninth grade student data. And so those success team leads bring the data and bring the protocols and walk the teachers through the different tiered supports that they could provide to the ninth grade students that they share. And the instructional coaches then also on those campuses bring instructional strategies to support. So those are the specific FTE that we allocate focused on that ninth grade on track rate.
And I'm gonna, we did hear kind of an update from Dr. Franco, so I'm gonna turn more on this topic about ninth grade on track.
Oh, yes. So I shared some, John Franco, Chief of Schools. Back to what Mr. Cruz was saying, just in terms of what is the return on investment. And so I just want to make sure I do mention this, it goes way back when, is that high school graduation, 86%, highest it's ever been in PPS. You also look at OSAS data, higher than the state. And so I just want to make sure that 3rd through 8th grade in math and ELA, that's still a long way to go, but in terms of making progress, I think that's important. So we're talking about return on investment. I shared some data since we just had the first semester, well, it ended a few weeks ago or so, on track rate for freshmen, and as Aurora said, distinct indicator of graduation was at 79. So 79% of our freshmen in PPS are on track, which means they need 24 credits to graduate, so that means they're at 6 or more. Or they're headed to get 6 or more. And so I think that's what you need.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, and then I'll turn it over. 5 high schools have reduced disparity for underserved students to 10% or less. From 2017 to 2022, ninth grade on track rates increased from 65% to 90% for all students, and from 48% to 86% for historically underserved students. That's the outcome of our ninth grade on track.
So I want to just really touch on the graduation rate piece, because I know it comes up, and I think it's great. I don't think the standards that we're hearing to for graduations is great. When you lower the standards, of course graduation is going to go up. It just makes sense. So I don't want us to get confused with graduation rates and proficiency, because we know, and it's already been said, that you can graduate and not be proficient. And so, that's just, you can graduate with all D's. That's just, that doesn't necessarily mean you're proficient. So I want to make sure we don't inflate the graduation rate as, anything but what they are, as far as the lower standard that the state has required us for us to reach that graduation rate. Because it still hasn't been able to be clear with me yet to how come we have our Black and brown kids here in third grade reading, fifth grade math, then all of a sudden they're up to a level at graduation. That doesn't happen in any district nationwide. That has never happened. So just want to make sure that we're clear. We're talking about graduation rates, which I think is great, but I think the mechanism that we're measuring graduation rates from the standards of the state is not that great.
I just like to throw out there when we start talking about graduation rates that if I took 10 kids on a field trip and came back with 8 of them, I'm still going to jail. Because what happened to the other 2 kids? So, I mean, before we just start, I'm just throwing that out there, right? It's I'm supposed to bring back, if I take 10 kids, I'm supposed to bring back 10 kids. Anything shy of 10 kids is ridiculous, especially if one of them 2 kids that don't come back is your kid. Because now you done lost your rabbit mind. And so I just want to throw that out there. I love when we talk about it. I just want to make sure that we keep everything in perspective when we start talking about it.
First of all, I love that because you're saying 100%, no question about it.
100%.
And I would say this too, because I was a part of the OBE high school graduation committee. And we look at, I think this could be an offside comment. I'd love to get into a conversation with you.
Okay.
But I would just say
talk
that
about it.
from an Oregon perspective in comparison to the state, the 24 credits that is needed, and it's significant. So I wouldn't say it's a lowering of the standards. As a matter of fact, if you compare Oregon to many states, Oregon requires much more from a credit perspective. Now, what you're talking about.
They require more credits, but the fidelity of those credits is not.
And that's a question. I think that's a great question. I think that we need to.
We'll talk.
Absolutely.
No, I
want to get us to the ESSER
too, though.
question, but sorry, I want to get us to the ESSER part of the presentation, but Dashel has had her hand up for a long time.
Hi, my name is Dashel, CBRC, and community member, parent of a student. And I, for the past 6 years, also was reviewing grant applications. I was a funder and currently president and CEO of Grantmakers of Oregon and Southwest Washington. So my question is about the actual structure of the grant application and the way it's written. Great presentation overall. Looking at the narrative though, and around community engagement. So for the required community engagement, it says that there were some focal groups and that surveys went out. So when I'm looking at the survey, so it's a 2-part kind of comment question-ish, I guess. So when I'm looking at the survey results, there was 559 responses to the survey, but for the, and about 20% of those folks that responded didn't state their demographics. But then we have 58% of those being white, 62% being women, 69% being parent and guardians, and 91% being English speakers, and with 53% being most frequently selected K through 5 as interest areas. Those then influence the data on those priority areas or influencing those interest and learning opportunity areas on how they landed. And then there's a statement that says we really couldn't, basically, and we couldn't disaggregate this data because of the numbers, and it's basically mostly white, right? So then when reading the narrative, what I noticed was that the narrative starts to use a lot of qualitative language, which is great, but there's no quantitative language really in there. Like it says things like years and years. And when you just glance at it and then you read through it, there's no real numbers in the narrative portion, which there should be a little bit of a balance in between there. So I would just say, when going back and looking at it again, that might be good to add that in, but also it is quite alarming to see those survey results being what they were and how they influence the hierarchy of what fell to the top and bottom. So with those responses, like the Black Student Excellence Center, was 3.1%, but we have some other ones that are super high. So I'm also then wondering if how these FTEs were contributed, was that also influenced by this data, because it is quite biased data.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And we, as the former chief engagement officer, I can tell you that surveys, and the board knows, we've had this millions of times, surveys only attract particular, folks that are online, active,
Can read.
have access, all of the things, right? So we know that overwhelmingly it's going to be skewed towards white women, and you indicated as such. That is why one of the strategies that we've implemented. Now, I will note that the scale is not as easy, right? Survey, you can reach 1,000 people like that, versus one of the strategies that we've implemented is this idea of focus groups. Because what we know, especially from our Black, Brown, Native communities, is that these massive sessions don't necessarily work, right? And we've heard that numerous of times, whether people vote on their feet, they don't show up. People tell us that they don't like big group gatherings because it feels like I can't provide my input. So one of the things that our engagement team, has worked with our departments is to really develop these focus groups. So again, it's 10, 12, 15 people in a room, whether it's a Black, so we hosted focal groups with migrant ed and Spanish-speaking families. We had a meeting with the District Student Council. We did have a meeting with Indian ed families, Black families, special education families. And so again, with the idea that they're, a representation of that information. Now, I'll say, so there's pause, and I also want to know, because you pointed out, in the survey, 3% or so was, wanted to support, or whatever the framing is, around the Center for Black Excellence. For us, as a school district and as the cabinet, we have to always look at all of this information through a lens, right? Through our racial equity lens. And so while we say 3% of folks gave this, promoted this or pushed this, what we know is that more broadly, this is an effort that is supported and is in direct interest of our Black leaders and our Black community and our Black students. And so, so it was important, and you'll see that in our ESSER dollars, right? This increase or this investment in CBSE as a result. So while we had 3%, response said yes interest, we still pushed it up because of our commitment to racial equity, social justice, particularly achievement of our Black and Native students.
I want to appreciate your question though, because I noticed that too, that trying to analyze the data, and so 3% of the people indicated a positive response to that question, but the only reason we're talking about it is because voters at 70% or whatever voted for it, to invest in it. So, do you guys, when you're analyzing the data, do you disaggregate the responses by race, and do you offer weights for questions? Also, just a note: there are survey firms that can do like dialing, very targeted dialing. So, to increase that response rate, there are survey firms that can do.
Yeah.
To offer a little bit of fidelity to the process.
I just got two things, one comment and then I have a question about the CTE portion. So one comment as far as when we talk about surveys and we talk about engagement pieces, and this is something that whoever needs to hear this needs to hear it. If we have opportunities for engagement and folks don't show up to be engaged, and we have multiple ways, multiple times that we're doing this, I know the history of how PPS has done it in the past, and we're doing stuff differently now. If we have those opportunities for people to show up, we're putting this, going out, all these different ways that we're doing engagement now, and they don't show up. If they don't invest, and I always say this, if you don't invest in that, you can't ask for a withdrawal later. So if you don't invest time, whether it's a phone call, whether it's a survey, whether it's coming to a meeting, whether it's going on Let's Talk and giving your opinion, if you don't invest that time to engage, you can't withdraw later on when it doesn't go the way that you think it should. And now that was one thing. So now the other question is about the CTE piece. So I want to make sure I understand. The grant that we put forth is what we see that we want to use these funds for, right? So for instance, when I asked about the size of the grant from 511 to 435, you said that's because the grant got smaller. But it's more because we prioritize differently, or is there a set measure that they're only giving 435 for the CTE portion, or that's what we said we were gonna spend on CTE portion?
So that's the Carl's Perkins grant, is that 435? And so it's a federal grant, but they allocate it to the state. And so the state right now, their estimate for next school year is 435.
For the CTE?
For the Perkins, which is the CTE, correct?
Okay.
That's the specific CTE grant. And so they're estimating a decrease in funding.
So I have a question around that. So when I look, because I'm confused, all these different pictures. I don't know what, oh, here it is.
So Measure 98 is also funds much of our CTE programming.
So the dollars that I see here, even though it's more than what this part here is, these are two different pots.
Correct. Correct. So the Measure 98 part, and so I keep calling it Measure 98, and I should be saying high school success, so I apologize. So the high school success grant can fund 3 buckets of work. CTE expansion, advanced coursework expansion, and dropout prevention. So that's the buckets that the high school success grant can fund. And then the Carl's Perkins is specifically a CTE grant.
So when I look at these, how do I know which bucket is coming out of?
Can you tell me the page number?
I don't know, I've got so many different pages.
So if you look,
It's ID 83.
if you look at, can you look at the one that says 23, 23 IGG budget?
IGP budget, 2023.
Yeah, I'm looking at the IGG budget, okay.
And so then if you go to page, back to page,
ID B3.
got it. So look at IDB. So here's the best way to look at it. So look on page 3 of that document. Yeah, yep. So you'll see you'll see CTE column. You'll see the CTE column budgeted, and that's where you start to see the numbers. And then proposed activity is the description there. So, for example, IDB 4, 69 pays for regional PD at 11,000.
So, okay, so I'm looking at it now, I guess. I hope I got the right one. So I'm gonna just go down. It says CTE teaching staff at identified high schools, FTE 2, then it goes up to 215,000.
So that's actually Measure 98.
So, I know, that's what I want to know. How do I know what bucket is coming out of by looking at this?
Oh, up here. So up here, there is, the different buckets are CSI, TSI, CTE, EIIS, HSS is high school success, or Measure 98.
Okay, so I see CTE, STA.
So keep going 2 more columns over. It's the high school HSS.
Gotcha, okay.
And then you start to see the list, the numbers
Over
there.
there, great, thank you. And then when we talk about CTE too, is any of the CTE stuff for middle schools as well? Or is it just high school?
High school.
Okay, well,
So, for the federal grant. So it's a little complicated in that ODE will only approve programs of study for high schools. At this point, the ODE is not approving any middle school formal CTE programs. So we can have career awareness and career exploration activities that we can fund 8th grade through the High School Success Fund. But Perkins can only be allocated to high school because it has to be tied to an authorized program of study.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're about an hour and a half in, because we started a little bit late. You have another part of the presentation around ESSER. Can you speak to that?
Yeah.
Come back and.
Yep. Sounds like a plan.
Ask, I was online for this first part, but the questions I had that I submitted around the grants those will be answered just as part of the written answers.
Yeah, we have them.
Yeah, we have them. I think we're planning by end of week. Is that by Thursday that we will have those responses?
Back to the board and to the whole CBMC.
And we've already started exploring them, and so we'll be ready by Thursday.
Can I just throw one more into that? Is that if if we're putting 20 into the arts pathways, are there other CTE pathways that are incomplete in different clusters?
Just start the question again, I missed the first part.
So we're
I
putting
apologize.
21 FTE into the arts pathways. So my question is, are there other CTE pathways that are incomplete in other schools that, and I don't need an answer right now, but that are still sitting out there? I just want to know kind of what's in the pipeline. So if we're betting big on arts, you don't have to answer now. You can.
I can, because the practice changed. So in the past, before 2017, we used to have a standalone CTE class. So for example, an intro to photography, CTE class. But now all CTE classes have to be tied to a program of study. So we no longer, if you think, I think back to 5 years ago in Jeannie, she used to call it little CTE and big CTE, if you remember. Do you remember? I remember she had a glossary. But so what she used to call little CTE no longer exists. So any CTE class has to be tied to a program of study. But what I will say is that
What's a program of study?
a program of study is a complete series of a progression of courses. So it's like an introduction course, an intermediate course, and it could be up to 2 different advanced courses. And so when we start to offer a program of study, a series of courses, there are a few new programs that even though we've submitted for the whole program of study, we only have the intro. So Jefferson is a great example of this. This is the first year we're starting 2 CTE programs of study at Jefferson. So they only have the intro to digital media class and the intro to the health occupations, but we're building. So when we submitted the application for approval to ODE, we had to submit the whole series of courses. So it's incomplete, but we have a plan for the courses, and that's exactly the FTE that you asked about from the Measure 98. That 215 is paying for those new pathways or programs of study, that the courses that will become a full program of study for CTE for Jefferson.
So that's helpful. I guess again, the follow-up piece, maybe it's the base data of like what programs of study do we have at each of the high schools? I'm sure you have some.
Provide those supplemental materials.
Provide that by Thursday for sure.
Great, because that'll give me the second piece.
Absolutely. So we're up to 78 programs of study now across the district. So generally speaking, we have 6 at each of the comprehensive.
In case people missed the side note, in the last 5 years, we've doubled the number of students participating in CTE from 5,000 students to 10,000 students, which is huge. I didn't want to let that go unsaid. And I know, Director Berman, you started your question by saying we're proposing to continue investing in 20 or so positions in arts pathways, but I want to make sure it's clear. That's not closing all of our arts pathways. That's to maintain closing the 3 prioritized clusters in Jefferson Roosevelt.
I'm just trying to put it in context of like what else, where are the places where we have gaps or
We have that in those supplemental materials that for our last board meeting that just came to us.
We have our CTE.
In board book under supplemental materials.
And we'll still build out the response for you, but.
Great, let's finish up the presentation and then.
Pardon?
Can Jordan get those questions to put in our?
Yeah, we will make sure that all CBRC and board questions around budget are shared together.
Just, we should include that other document, that whole thing.
Okay, so I'm going to move us on to the ESSER presentation, and then we're going to come back for more questions.
Yeah, so we can move on. So now let's talk about the elementary and secondary school relief funds, which is commonly known as ESSER. And ESSER is a restricted federal funding source, part of the special revenue pie. And it's approximately there's approximately $36 million that remains in ESSER, which must be spent by September 2024. Just kind of, we mentioned that last time, just kind of reiterating that that's sunsetting. So this is the last year of ESSER, and at the federal level, there's been no discussion regarding, it stands for Elementary and Secondary School Relief Funds. The one-time funding, and there's no conversations on renewing this funding at the federal level. And so then on the next slide, this shows how the approximately 36 million is allocated across 4 key strategic outcomes, with the majority of investments focused on developing the continuum of the graduate portrait. So about 7.5 million for the ongoing critical work in professional development and curriculum, which is part of our instructional framework. And then the other primary area of investment is in our multi-tier school level systems and structures of support. So out of that 11.3 million, about 8.8 million represents the school improvement grants. And on the next slide, so this slide highlights many of the ESSER investments for next year. For example, this was mentioned earlier, the continuing to target learning specialists to support reading and math for our Black and Native students. And to add some additional details, we did introduce school improvement grant to provide some flexibility for school leaders to work with their respective communities on some strategic initiatives. And school leaders continue to work on this. And although we don't have all of the information yet, I can share some preliminary numbers. How are the numbers rolling up? And as of yesterday, approximately 57, currently schools are projected to fund 57 FTEs with the school improvement grant. We're still working on a breakdown on what are the roles of those FTEs.
I'm sorry, what did you say, 57 schools?
Schools have so far identified 57 FTEs to be funded, full-time employees to be funded out of the school improvement grants. We're still working on the breakdown of the roles, like are those all teachers, are they EAs, are they reading specialists, kind of like we're still compiling that information. And schools have identified about $800,000 so far in proposed contracts or other non-personnel related items. And there's about $2.8 million pending that schools are still working through and figuring out how they're going to allocate. And last but not least, and then I'll turn it over to Ronnie. This is just a snapshot, somewhat similar to what we previously shared. You all have a picture or a blown up version of this in your packet. And that really concludes this.
So again, just as a reference point, your budget, our budget, proposed budget for ESSER is here. And it's all on one page. So it is on one page. And it's how we're allocating $36 million.
And if you go back to that first bullet on the previous slide, Grace, that gets exactly to your question that you asked. So these are different and more targeted than the instructional coaches that are being set aside in the general fund budget.
Correct. Yeah.
Wait, say that again?
So see this first, Grace was asking about what are the targeted FTE for Black and Native students, and then we had the conversation about instructional specialists. These are different, these are additional, and these are ESSER funded, and they're more they're targeted. Those other ones aren't, which she was saying maybe they.
Yeah, just.
And these ones go away after a year.
That's correct. That's correct. Yep.
Okay, hold on.
This is only 1 year.
Roger had his hand up.
Byrene, in all due respect, Byrene had her question first.
Yeah, I was just wondering, and we've communicated with school-based, with like administration and also with the families that like any FTE that you buy won't be sustained without the ESSER funds and that those are ending. And so I think just like making sure, and I guess it's more of a common question, but that we are communicating with families that the increase in FTE that you're seeing this year will only be for this year. Because I know Amy also expressed concern that we are allowing these ESSER funds, which I think ultimately, like, it should be up to the community and if they're okay with adding an FTE for only 1 year. But I just think that needs to be communicated with all of our community partners, like including PAT, who it could potentially also affect. But like those positions will be gone after this year.
Yes, and I think one of the other things we've communicated over the past few months is also approaching this as a pilot as well. So yes, this is one-time funding, but we also want to understand what are the opportunities here as well as we pilot this and consider some of the feedback we receive from school leaders as we're continuing to work through our strategic planning process, both from the perspective of how are we supporting school leaders with their school improvement plans, but also the reality of it is that, yeah, it's a pilot, it's a one-time funding, but we want to take a look at what are some of the areas that we could, some bright spots that could come out of this moving forward.
Well, I think Barney's right on the target. This is one-time funding, and I have to say that I'm worried, pilot or not, that you're going to raise expectations for continued need for funding in the future, and with a house under one control of a party and another house in control of the other in Washington, I'm not hopeful that we're going to see a great deal of extra funding coming out of federal government anytime soon. And it's worrisome that this proposes using ESSER funds for a one-time purpose that it really has ongoing ramifications.
And I thought,
This is, sorry, you want to go?
and I thought when we were talking about ESSER funds previously in the previous couple of years, that we would not use ESSER funds for FTE.
So those are the best practices that have been outlined, and that's what Bryony was referring to from our previous conversation. But one thing I think is important when we look at the ESSER funds is how directly tied are there to specific pandemic related, let's call them emergencies. You know, like that's a justifiable use of FTE that's not sustainable because we had an impact that hopefully also is not going to be sustained. And so, you know, my question when I look at these ESSER appropriations is, should we maybe focus some more on our middle schools? Because I think if we look at, when we look at our whole ecosystem and we see like who is still really reeling from the pandemic, I mean, it's all our students, but it's in my mind, really middle schools, and that would be a justifiable use of that unsustainable funding because they're not regulated yet. They're not back to, you know, pre-pandemic type environments. So I think, you know, your points are a really good one about that we need to be careful about where we invest this FTE in these, since they're not sustainable.
So I'm trying to understand what you're saying. So when I look at learning acceleration specialists to support reading and math for Black and Native students, when we were allocating 20 FTE, and we know, going back to your statement, that, you know, we're talking about stuff that was targeted during the pandemic, do we think that's going to be done or solved next year?
Well, kind of like what Bertrand has indicated is that we're monitoring and looking at some of our early data. This was just implemented this school year currently. It will be sustained and continued for next school year. And then as a proof point, if you will, if we see some bright spots or some deep benefits for our targeted students, then it has that conversation open to say, if it is no longer ESSER funded, is there an appetite and funding based on data and outcomes to continue the program?
Which is a wonderful opportunity that we rarely have.
So if I'm a kid, right, I'm a fifth grade or third grade kid learning how to read and stuff, and I get this additional support, and we see that it could be maybe not 100% growth or model, then I am exposed for the next year to maybe or maybe not in a comeback.
Right, but keep in mind that this is,
that's right.
that is right, and, may I offer the and?
I'm listening.
Okay, the and is that this is an intensified effort. This is what old school, we used to call like a triple dose, right? So all students have access to the grade level content. Then we have through our RTI and MTSS process, interventions, if it's the same targeted student that needs support. And then on top of it, we have the learning acceleration. So the learning acceleration is not the first measure of intervention for the student, nor the second measure of intervention for the student, but it is a triple dose, if you will, to really intensify our efforts, because we predicted with the pandemic that there was a learning loss for our students. So in this 2-year proof point, we want to see if we could bridge the gap of that, and then continue our other funded efforts to provide interventions, differentiated learning, and meeting the needs of students.
And you plan to measure that through maps?
You can measure that in a number of ways.
No, I'm asking, what are you guys' plan to measure that?
So we're doing it in a number of ways. So when we do the intervention with students, right, we know that best practice with intervention is that I give you a dose of intervention for a short period of time, and then I do a quick assessment to see if that dose worked. Then I continue on with the intervention. So it's localized, it's specific to the intervention, and then over the 3 parts of the year, we then also measure it against maps.
Olympia. I think my main concern with using ESSER funds for this is, we're saying we're going to try to solve this problem through funds that we can only use once. And I think what Director Hobbs was saying is, we're saying, we're not going to solve this problem over 1 year, but we're saying that the money could be gone next year. So I just don't think, I think it would be a better practice to use a more sustainable funding model for these FTEs, so that, because then we can ensure that we address this problem and that the problem, we find a solution.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's not a solution that where the funding doesn't go away.
And I agree with that, Olympia, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that is the reason why we want to continue to monitor the efforts, so that we can see if it's successful, that we could then have the discussion of where there's an appetite and funding to continue the model. It would take trade-offs. It's like that trade-off conversation. If we have the trade-off conversation here and now regarding ESSER, or if we utilize the ESSER and then have the trade-off conversation next year.
Yeah. And this is Norberto, and to be fair, we've had that trade-off conversation. We're having it. We started with $110 million 3 years ago, and we started this year with $75 million. So as we've continued the step down into the soft landing, we've been having those trade-off conversations and assessing, well, maybe there's less of this over here because we want to move over next year learning acceleration specialists, and that's part of the ongoing work. Whether it's could the learning acceleration specialists, if it turns out to be a strategy they want to keep doing, does it end up under the general fund? Does it end up in another funding source under title or something like that, where we can assess those trade-offs?
My worry is that we do this program, it works, and knowing the deficits that we're going to be incurring, for the next couple years, that we have this, it works, but then there's no funding for it next year, and then the only person who suffers is our kids.
Then that's up to us.
Would you rather not try?
No, what I'm saying is I would rather have this go into general funds now.
Basically flip it.
I would rather for this go to general funds now, and maybe use these general funds for something else that could be temporary.
Yeah.
And then if we see if it works, it's already in the general fund.
It's a great question to explore. I think what I heard, but again, I think it's a good question to follow up on, is if what Dr. Proctor said, if our interventions 1 and 2, which are funded with general fund, that's the trade-off to intervention 3, is that we drop 1 or 2, then we haven't done anything for our kids, right? Like, we're not at it anymore. So I think, to me, the question, yes, if there's excess general fund that we could fund for this and do it permanently, that sounds great. I want to know what those trade-offs are, because what I'm sensing is we have a lot of interventions that are already in that general fund. This is an additional one we're trying out.
I guess maybe the question is, instead of the trade-off being between 1 and 2, and an additional, the trade-off of something else, not one or two.
Well, that's what I said, depends on what that trade-off is.
Well, and I think if we see that it does, I mean, I think we've had lots of questions. This is Ailey talking. If we've had lots of questions about accountability and like data around things being successful. So I think if we see that this high dose is successful and we still feel we need it, then it's on us as a board to work with the superintendent to say, we need to preserve this. Let's pilot it. Let's see if it actually bears fruit. And then if it does and we still need it, then let's invest from general fund in it. That's the strategy I see.
And that's why we've invested so much effort in actually the monitoring and assessment and evaluation of whether these strategies are effective, like Dana's entire presentation to us around summer learning, to see which of these interventions have really moved our kids.
All right, I want to get to.
I kind of interrupted.
Well, as superintendent, you said part of it already, Director Constant. When we conceptualize this particular strategy or tactic, and we heard Dana speak on this and can talk in more detail about how the work is going now, to specifically case manage particular students to get that triple dose. We will be the first to make sure it's sustained if we see that the return on investment is bearing improved results for students we're most concerned about. So I don't think you need to worry on staff's part, that you wouldn't see that continuing forward if we see the add value.
Great.
And I just note slide 3 is, this is a great conversation, but I think I would note slide 3 that we're talking about different buckets, but towards the strategic outcome and our compass and our vision, right? So while we're talking about these little different pockets, they all come together to inform, to actually make the work happen.
All right, Grace.
I just have another question.
Grace's hand.
I thought you said great.
For someone. It was great, and now we're going to go to Grace.
Okay.
I think Alona had her hand up first. You want to go, Alona? Oh, okay. I just had a quick question on the learning acceleration specialists. There are 20 across the district. I'm curious what their case, if anyone in the room knows, what is their caseload?
Dana?
Sure. So there's FTE for 20. We actually have 17 right now serving at 16 schools, and we're projecting to have 20 for next year. We had a few unfilled jobs, and we wanted to make sure we had the educators who were right for the opportunity to really provide that support for our students. And so the caseloads vary depending on the schools. The schools were selected based on having a larger number of Black and Native American students who were not yet achieving at the levels we know they're capable of. So that's how the schools were selected. And the individual educators are working with 3rd graders for reading, or 5th graders for math, or 8th graders for literacy, or 8th graders for math. And then we have 2 supporting advanced pathways at Roosevelt and McDaniel in terms of really supporting students and getting over the line, not just enrolling in those AP classes, but really having success in those AP classes and those advanced pathways. So their caseloads vary because each of our schools are different, but they range between, it would take me longer than we have time to pull the exact numbers, but I can certainly provide that for you later. They range between 20 up to 40 at individual schools.
Raj, is this related to that?
No.
Okay. Alana?
Yes. Okay, cool. So Ilana J. Wilson, she, her pronouns, CBRC. I understand people's concern with this using the funding that might not come back. And so, I also do believe in we should use these funds well, right? So I personally, and from looking at the impacts on community, would be fine with this being used for this if there is a commitment from the staff and also from our board members who are for sure going to be here next year. That's you, Gary, Julia, and Herman, that you are going to take a direct look at this for next year's budget and make sure that there is funding for this. That's just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think somebody else is next.
Oh, was there another? I thought we got the hands up there.
Did Grace already go?
Yes.
You want to go, Gary?
No, go ahead.
So my first question, I have a few. Just clarification questions. Number one, is this the first time we used a lot of one-time grant funding for FTE? Like how do we normally fund FTE? because I guess I'm kind of concerned about the 20 FTE, just the one-time funding, and then the other FTE that we have for the student.
Did we do 40
So I'm
last
just
year?
curious of, like, what is that? What is the normal allocation for that?
So I'll try at it. Nilberto here speaking. It really comes down to like the funding source.
Okay.
So, for example, general fund and special revenue fund, it's 4,000 plus FTEs that are funded. And the biggest driver of that is our staffing plan, which drives FTEs to school sites. So that's like the clearest mechanism that provides funding. So we want to know, well, like how much, what are the FTEs, how's that generated? The staffing plan has that information. When it gets to grants, it's going to come down to the restrictive uses. What can we use it? Does it make sense to get a contract instead? Does it make sense to use an FTE instead? So it's going to vary on that. But then, like in this example with ESSER funding, there really was no guidance around don't use it for FTE or yes, use it for FTE. But it was with I guess I shouldn't say guidance, but there was the guidance of like, remember, this is one-time funding. So when you think about your strategies, it's essentially thinking about what is it that you're trying to accomplish and does it make sense to add an FTE? Do you use ESSER and supplement your general fund? So thinking about the staffing plan. Last year, we did a lot of that. We used the ESSER funding, or for this current year, we used ESSER funding to supplement our general fund and support that staffing formula. And I can't remember the exact number, but I believe it was like 100 plus FTEs that were funded through ESSER one-time funding for this year. And so the guardrails we're thinking about is what does the soft landing look like as we approach the sunsetting of these funds? So in being able to support the planning with the one-time funding, we decided to try out again, thinking about the school leader feedback, how can we leverage some of this ESSER funding, but provide schools and their respective communities opportunities to assess, does it make sense to use it for FTE? Does it make sense to use it for contract?
And what I remember the decision we made about ESSER funds and staff, and this is Ailey speaking, sorry, board member, ESSER funds and staffing last year is because of the sort of drop down that we experienced with all sorts of reasons why enrollment is declining. We decided as a board to use 40, I think it was about 40 FTE from ESSER funds to go into classrooms, so to deal with those staffing ratios. And then the rest of the 60 or so for the 100 were things that were capacity building, like restorative justice folks at the middle schools to do some of what Director Constan was talking about shoring up those kids who we see are struggling the most post-pandemic. And so a lot of those other 60 were, we knew, short investments to try to build capacity and address the emergency of the pandemic, which is what the dollars are for. And then 40 were to sort of bridge that gap as we continue to see declining enrollment, knowing that we wouldn't have all 40 of those again to give this year. So that's the strategy we as a board sort of directed staff to look at as we were making those decisions last year about how to use those one-time funds.
So do we already have a detailed plan on a lot of these overall allocations? So like, for example, I see a learning acceleration specialist, the professional development, like is there already a detailed plan, or is this kind of like an overview, kind of like this is something that we want to do and we're still working on that to implement? I'm just curious of where you guys are in terms of the planning process of these.
Yeah, so I think for all of these, the planning process is full in motion. So when I think, and I welcome Dr. Armstrong to talk about the instructional framework plan, and the one area that is still in development is the gun violence programming, and there's a task force underway to assess that, and so I think that's the one line item that's evolving based on ongoing conversations and feedback to figure out how could the $300,000 can support that. But the rest of these plans are laid out, the ongoing activities with the evening scholars and kind of continuing a lot of that work. But thinking about the biggest proportion of this is the instructional framework, as I point towards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to tell you, we believe in planning forward. And so whether we're using a resource now or we'll use it in the future, we are constantly having conversation about, you know, what are we doing and then how are we going to allocate resource towards it or even propose. But I do want to turn over to my Senior Director of Teacher Professional Learning to introduce herself and share just a little bit on that planning process. You mentioned professional learning.
Hi everyone, Christina Howard, Senior Director of Teacher Professional Learning. So we're doing a lot of cross-departmental planning right now and trying to align professional learning across teachers and school leaders as well as central office staff. And so we are taking, next year we have time allocated for professional learning days within the school calendar. So there's 3 professional learning days that are in the school calendar approved by this group. So thank you. And then we have summer institutes that we're going to be launching this summer. There's going to be 3 professional learning days in June and August. So teachers will have the opportunity to go either in June or August. And then there's going to be a series of staff meeting times where they will be school-based this year, where folks will have some centralized professional learning around a unit planning process that teachers will engage in with grade-alike and content-alike groups. And that will happen a series of times across the school year. And then we also have a PLC process, which is where teachers organize themselves in weekly team meetings in grade-alike and content-alike groups, where they will experience a form of professional learning as well that is in alignment with our unit planning process. And so that is what we're in. We have a comprehensive plan that I would be happy to share information, details, and things like that on, that all stakeholders that we're working with are going to be engaging in a feedback process and helping to set that stage so that hopefully every group in our instruction and school communities can have an aligned approach to professional learning. And it's a systematic approach.
Thank you for that. And as you know, I tried to recruit you a little bit before this meeting for the parent advisory on curriculum assessment, a new group that we're starting to have this advisory group who are parents and connected to schools to weigh in on our plans and work that we're doing around the instructional framework. And so we have a variety of stakeholder groups and definitely some robust plans in place as we move that work forward as well.
Last question and comment. I'm done. So, okay. First of all, thank you for the presentation, the information. It's great. I think it's hard, and I'm hoping the board will have time to really delve into the data that they're referring to, and to really look, behind the weeds and really see what's working and what's not working, and to begin to question what are we continuing funding? Why are we just, saying, okay, yep, we're going to fund this, and we're not looking at the outcomes. And since we do have specific board goals, I just wanted to kind of put on the record what an instructional coach looks like on the ground, because I'm on the ground and I'm advocating for the Jeromes and the Canes and the Isaiah, shout out to them. And what I see in an instructional coach, I see, number one, when I'm on the ground, I see Black kids being tracked into a certain math class, which is not the same math classes that my kids go to. My kids are in a different math class where they're the only Black kids in the class. So how are we investing the dollars to be able to deal with that particular inequity? And then also too, when we look at data, when we're saying MAPS data, and Dr. Proctor mentioned classroom data. That's the first time I heard that. And I'm hoping, are you guys able to read, is the board able to be able to analyze classroom data, to actually measure results and see growth in Jerome and Isaiah and kind of see, okay, they were at this grade level and now they're operating at this grade level. That is a measurable result. Sample, great job. I tip my hat off to you. So I'm curious to know, are you guys going to, is that the expectation that you have for our district? Are you going to delve deeper into the data and look and see what's working and what's not working. And then also too, I just want to reiterate that what does it look like to if Jerome is operating at a certain grade level, he's in middle school, what does it look like in this $51 million? Like, I don't see it. When you say instructional coach, and I'm telling you what an instructional coach looks like on the ground, and it's not really, and it's still missing Jerome and Isaiah, I'm trying to figure out where is this money, how is it still hitting them? And I've been advocating for them for the last 5 years, and they're still operating at the same level. So now I'm here in this position, I'm seeing where the money is going, and I'm really scratching my head like, wow, I'm here on the ground, I'm seeing what's happening, but I'm not seeing any type of results. But yet I'm seeing all this money being spent. So I just wanted to say that on the record.
Thank you. Appreciate
And I would
it.
actually, just to add, just comment, I think, and maybe it's part of our next steps here, Roseanne, the slide here, because next week we will have our partners at ERS. And as board members remember, when we left off the conversation with ERS, we were going to talk about that student experience. So, right, the board left with that conversation about, to your point, we're allocating money, to CSI, TSI schools. We're doubling those investments, and yet the results are not there. So the question is, what is that? And as we all know, right, it's not just dollars, right? It is belief system. It is policies. It is a number of things. What happens in the classroom. Right, the fidelity to a core instruction, all of those things are critical, right? And they're not siloed; they're all integrated. And I think so. Next week we will have that conversation where we're going to dive even deeper to that in that question. Because you're right, I think we're all wrestling with this. How is it that we're investing so much money, and yet our Black and brown boys and girls and kids are still behind?
So I'm going to go to Byrony and then Grace, and then we'll come back to board members. So Byrony.
Byrony, student rep. I'm also happy for these questions to just be recorded and then we can get back to me for the sake of time. 2 questions. First one on ESSER. I see that principals were supposed to submit basically at this time would have submitted their plans to us. And I wonder whether they're just submitting a plan, like saying, hey, this is what I want to do with the money, or whether it's a plan and then justification and including like the process they went through to how they decided or decided to invest in. And then my second question was just on going back to something that we talked about more broadly with, I'm seeing like on slide 14, alignment to strategic plan, there's like safe operations of schools, and obviously that's been a big topic. Just going back to something that we've discussed in previous meetings, how are we aligning our budget focuses with that of other local agencies? Like how are we aligning that with Multnomah County? Are they investing more heavily in student safety after recent events? If so, can that potentially mean that we can spend our resources elsewhere? I just wonder how communication is going for that. And then just last comment, I guess this is, when we're evaluating, as you said, sort of these experiments or like these waves, seeing whether these ESSER funds are being spent in a good way and whether we should continue that spending potentially if something's really successful. I would also love if like direct student feedback could be part of that process. So maybe before we go into before we go into the budget process for next season, if we can just get the idea in early that maybe we should create like some sort of form for student feedback, or whether we can sort of plan some targeted sessions before the budget process next year to make sure that students are included in the feedback loop for how ESSER funds or how useful they were.
I'm going to suggest at this stage we just put questions on the record and they can be answered as part of the process. Grace?
Hi, I have the question that could be answered on the record. I'm wondering how much of the ESSER funds from last year were used for the Online Learning Academy, and clearly it's not on the list this year. I'm wondering what the trade-offs were and what choices were made for spending that money in other ways. And would like to know more about that decision.
Great, thanks, Grace. I actually had a similar question I was going to put on the record. There was a social media post that sort of a similar question that sort of referred to if looking, and again, I haven't verified it, but if you look at like some of the things in this year's budget, it indicated that there would be some additional money on Online Learning Academy, and it's not there. So I guess the question's twofold. One, and I can send that to you, is that accurate? And if it is, let's make sure we're explaining, I think to Grace's question, you know, how that money was reallocated to other things and why. And then if it's not accurate, then let's also explain to us and also the community what maybe missing. So I'll get you more detail. I think it's the same question, Grace.
Yeah.
Great. I saw a couple of hands down here. I think Michelle and Amy might have their hands up.
I'm, in the interest of time, I can answer it, or ask it another time in writing.
Okay.
Just the question I raised before, I'd like to put it on the record about connecting our ESSER investments to what we see as specifically pandemic-related impacts. Being very intentional about that.
I have a question, but I want my answer now, though. I get 100,000 emails. What is the FEMA hold?
Yeah, so the
Yeah, did we ever get that?
So we received some funding, yes. So we have what was considered like, it's considered like, so FEMA is a federal emergency management agency. And there are what we consider eligible reimbursements that FEMA can reimburse us for. So during COVID, the federal government said, you can submit these claims to get reimbursed, whether it's equipment or people's time supporting specific activities. So we submitted these reports to FEMA.
Wi-Fi.
I'm sorry? Wi-Fi, a variety of different things. And so then if FEMA reimburses us, then I'm getting it confused. So essentially, if the FEMA hold is in there in case FEMA does not reimburse us, then ESSER pays for those COVID-related activities. And so we don't have to use the general fund to pay for it.
But what happened with that last year? Was it was 9 million or 12 million in the budget last year?
Correct.
So what happened after that?
So it was about $11 million. And so you're seeing that now here. So now that
still hasn't paid us back.
No, they did. Sorry, excuse me. They did reimburse us. So yes.
For that total amount?
No, they reimbursed us for about $5 million. So the balance is the $6 million that we're seeing.
And might they still reimburse us for that, or are we out of luck with FEMA?
We're hopeful, but it does pose a question, right? Because at some point, we're going to have to make a decision if as we're getting close to September 2024 and figuring out, okay, we haven't heard from FEMA yet. So we need to then make a decision around spending the ESSER fund.
So the issue is, will we have confirmation before our budget needs to be?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to.
Hold on, that's still not clear. I mean, you said a lot, but I didn't really understand. So this $6 million, is this $6 million that we are looking to get reimbursed?
Yes.
We've asked for it. They haven't given it to us yet. We gotta hold on to it.
I understand what reimbursement means. I want to make sure that that's what I was saying. So is there plans if we get this reimbursed, what we're going to do with the money?
So we have part of that conversation is our tier 1, tier 2. So there are plans. We incorporated that as part of our IGG plan. So as we think about, okay, what are some of the other activities we could do? There's a list, everything from funding next summer.
Okay, I'll just asking. Just
yes.
keep it simple.
Yes, sorry.
Yes,
Yes.
yes or no?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Julia.
So it's a follow-on question, and maybe it's just a framework for thinking. It's a follow-on question to Amy's about tying what we're doing to impacts from the pandemic. I think we all know, just because the ESSER money is going away doesn't mean the impact from the pandemic has been cured. So I'm wondering if there's a way, because I'm thinking about future conversations with voters about funding and conversations with legislators around funding. how we capture that so that we're not losing that tail, like, oh, well, the federal government's done paying for things, and so now we're done with it. And so how do we continue to show what we're gonna need to do probably over a decade while these students make their way through school, the things that we're going to address. And I think it'll be really powerful, and just because the federal government has decided like they're done, I don't think it ends the conversation. So I'd
Absolutely.
So whatever is done to answer Amy's question, like how do we carry that forward?
This is where our continued advocacy is going to be important. I think, one, districts are trying to stay afloat, especially smaller districts in Oregon, maybe don't have our capacity. But you're already seeing, where federal resources are tapering off, the need still exists. You have, at least in this legislative session, talks about how do we focus on early literacy to support students that are way off grade level? How do we maintain extended learning opportunities through summer programming? Those are two good ones to start with. I would love to see something in there around mental behavioral health. I would love to see something in there around school safety. I could go down the list, mental behavioral health. Those are all areas that I hope the legislature accounts for so that districts can provide those supports.
Yeah, I think there's this double whammy because people are like, we're going to get less money because you have fewer students. But it's like, so that's one thing. But on the other hand, we still have the impacts of the pandemic. And that seems like something that all these districts can sort of galvanize around, like as we move out of the ESSER funding.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. And I would say, and over the last year, really, I would say that we're moving away, because I think what you're saying is like, how do we start talking about the strategic long-term plan for closing these gaps, right? Like, how do we talk about that versus, I think what most people talk about is the buckets of money, right? No, what you're saying is like, we need to tell the narrative about how we plan to close those opportunity gaps over the
Buckets
next.
of money come after,
Correct.
should follow.
Yes.
And I think that's a
If we
great.
just talk about like enrollment, like, that's a much harder conversation versus here's the gaps we're trying to close. Here's the gaps that were exacerbated by the pandemic.
Absolutely.
And outside of the dollars coming in, we need to be talking about accountability. Because if we can do all this stuff, but if we're not accountable, to getting this stuff done in a meaningful way, then it's not gonna make a difference. So when we're asking questions of how we know this stuff is getting done and what are we doing to try to make this get done the right way, accountability is gonna be a huge and important issue. Everybody has to be accountable, from the superintendent all the way down to the janitors and everybody in between. And as we talking about true accountability, it is here just for talk, because if there is no accountability for Black kids, brown kids to increase in their proficiency levels and to close those gaps, if we can sit here, everybody gets paid, right? Whether those kids learn or not, that's a problem. If everybody here who get paid and can get their 401ks and do all this stuff, but our kids are not learning, that's because we don't have no accountability system here. And then all of us are just literally getting paid off the back of these kids. So we have to talk about accountability, because if you're not accountable, then you shouldn't be here, period. And this is how I'm feeling, because there's a $1.8 billion that's coming because of these kids. Not because I did some or started a business, not because nobody here started a business and titans of industries, none of that. It's because of these kids. And if we don't have accountability, then none of this stuff is gonna make a difference.
I completely agree with that, Gary. And also, I think, to your point, Jonathan, about the gains that we have made, I think it's really important when we talk about that with our community to talk about how they are directly related to specific investments, so that we see accountability on both sides,
So I often hear Director Hollins bring this up. Good, I grew up that way, be held accountable. Something I learned through my 2 tours of duty in graduate school is for every measure of accountability, make sure you've provided a measure of support. So
Yes.
I think part of what you're seeing in the evolution, the journey we've been on as a district is a huge debt in the professional capital building, which is a body of research, building the understanding, the knowledge base, the pedagogy, the cultural responsiveness, the data literacy. I can go down the list. You have to equip people to have those understandings, make those expectations clear, then in all fairness, hold people accountable. But we just can't skip over, and so that's our race against time right now, because we know students are in classes today, and we gotta get to outcomes as quickly and efficiently as possible.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask that additional questions. Where should they go? Superintendent, from board members or CBRC members? To you.
To our Q&A.
Yeah, so
Mailbox.
for Roseanne. To Roseanne.
Okay, Roseanne.
So do you want, so just to be clear, Roseanne, do you want these emailed to you or is there a form that they need to submit?
Right now, email.
Okay.
And should
Okay. Just to be
CBRC
clear.
members
Yes, so
email
at this-
Roseanne or Doris?
So, well, I would assume Roseanne, to basically make it a one-stop shop. So we've captured all the questions that were asked tonight, and then additional questions that you either have that weren't asked or that you want to ask moving forward. Feel free to email those to Roseanne. We will have an ongoing sort of comprehensive Q&A. Great. Really, really helpful. Any final comments?
I just want to note the next steps, make sure everybody's familiar with the next steps because I don't want surprises. So next week, on the 21st, you will consider and vote to approve our plan. We must submit it by March 31st. We also will have an ERS presentation next week. And there we will be able to talk about classroom staffing protections. You will get that, I think by the end of the week. By Thursday, sorry. And then the full budget proposal is presented on April 25th. So I just want to make sure.
Question, do you want CBRC involved in any of those meetings?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well,
yeah,
that's, I think you already are, right?
Very.
Roger, we haven't had a chance to talk to the board chair, board leadership, but staff did talk about that this morning and thought it would be beneficial to have community voice in these rooms as long as board members feel so inclined.
Yeah, so question about one of the bullet points up there. So we'll see the staffing for the schools. Will there also be overlaid the school improvement plan FTE that have been submitted and approved, the 57?
So,
Will we see that all in one layered place?
Yes, and I need to connect with Dr. Adams, but that's how the information is being put together, is to have this all-inclusive view of the class sizes. So last year, we had the heat map.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's essentially like, what does a heat map look like for this upcoming year?
Yeah, and it would be with the.
With
the 50.
Correct, yes.
Yep.
Dr.
Yeah,
Adams today.
thank you. Yeah.
He'll have the heat map completed in the morning for the board, whether it incorporates what we've learned so far as added positions invested through the school improvement fund. Because I know our supervisors are still in conversation with some of our principals.
Well, it's important to be able to look at before and after also.
Sure.
So, yeah, baseline and added.
Lots more budget conversations to come. Thank you. We got into a lot of good detail today. We are going to do a consent agenda to finish up our board meeting. Thank you to our CBRC members for joining us today. Y'all don't have to.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys. Great questions.
Okay, before we adjourn, we want to get to the consent agenda for this evening. So, Ms. Bradshaw, are there any changes to the consent agenda? And was there an item added, was the field trip added? And that was come around, but there is not a change to what was posted previously. Oh, I'm sorry, I was thinking there was the rest,
It's just
sorry.
the Roseway Heights, that's next week.
Oh, this is the consent agenda item, right, for tonight, okay. Do I have a motion and a second to adopt the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Great, Director Constant moves, Director Lowry seconds. Is there any board discussion on the consent agenda?
Yeah, what is it again?
This is just the coolest thing.
Congratulations to those kids.
Roseway Heights is going on a field trip to New York.
2 kids.
Oh.
They won. Sorry, not the whole school.
They won a
Just 2
national
students,
contest.
Oh, sure.
Sure.
Eighth grade class.
Let's vote.
So, I have one thing to say, so I'm gonna be nitpicky about this. I just wanna point out, that the fact that we're approving this, I still feel like is not a good use of staff time. It's not good for the people going. I don't think this is an appropriate role for the board to be playing. And I know this came up in the policy committee, and the policy committee disagreed with me because we have larger concerns about how our field trip policy goes. I'm just going to say again on the record, I'm going to say it every time. When we do stuff like this, staff have to scramble. They have to get it before the board. The students right now are thinking, well, I don't know, are we going? I don't know. We got to wait for the board to approve it. This is not an appropriate role for a school board to play. This is an appropriate role for the superintendent to play. If we have policy issues around field trips, we should address them through policy and talk about them at a big picture level, not through holding individual trips like this hostage. I'm going to say it every time. With that, are we ready to vote?
I am ready.
10 seconds, I mean, because Gilder Lehrman annually awards these, our kids are gonna get to go to a Broadway matinee show of Hamilton, they're gonna get to go to Ellis Island, they're gonna get to go to Museum of Jewish History, to Statue of Liberty, I mean, they're gonna have a whole experience.
And they did all this research and wrote stuff to be able to get to do this. It's a huge accomplishment.
So this would be great to like elevate, not for staff time on that, but for great, celebrate the students.
Yes. It's a great experience, and we can all
Congratulations.
summarize these for you in other ways.
I want to make an amendment. I'm joking.
I'm so
I was just gonna say, I think a board member should go and represent with the school.
The Sherrod Soccerones will give you a call.
We'll now vote on resolution 6682. All in favor, please indicate by saying yes.
Yes.
All opposed, indicate by saying no. Student Representative McMahon.
Yes.
Any abstentions? We approved that by a vote of 7-0. Student Representative McMahon voting yes. Thank you, everybody.
Can you let them know, Margaret?
And we are adjourned.